This week, George Zimmerman's attorneys said they are waiving their stand your ground hearing for April 22nd. They say no need. We simply can plead self-defense. That's actually BS. I think they knew if they lost that stand your ground hearing, it would look bad publicity-wise. They also would have had to lay out a lot of their case as well. And so I think they're trying to say, let's roll the dice in June. They didn't want to get embarrassed.
Absolutely. They don't want to taint the jury. George Zimmerman has a huge problem. And thank God for people like you who are not going to let the issue go. He murdered Trayvon Martin in cold blood. The American public knows it, and they want to just do as much as possible to keep the jury from remembering everything that happened, and that's why they're not having that hearing.
I think also they waived this particular hearing, and that doesn't mean that he's waiving the defense. And it's important to note that also this attorney has requested a continuance of the trial. It was denied,
right.
And so this was the next step. This just goes to show you they're having a really tough time coming up with an adequate defense for this particular
Any defense.
Yeah,
that's right.
What is the defense?
Well, they're going to use self-defense. The trial is slated to begin June 10th, and so we'll see what happens there. I do go right ahead.
You know, the thing that I've learned, especially if you remember the O.J. Simpson trial and Nicole Brown Simpson, is that you're never privy to all the evidence.
True that.
And, you know, I just want to say with caution that anything can happen with a juror of your peers in a court of law. So we'll just have to wait and see.
But I'll say this here. If it wasn't for the protests and wasn't for the pressure, we wouldn't even be at this point.
Absolutely.
I do want to get to this, though, before we run out of time, and that is Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez died this week. And it was very interesting watching the reactions. So many Americans, I see a lot of these journalists, he was a thug, he was shameful. But then, of course, you had millions who were turning out for his funeral. Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr. and others went down there for his funeral. Last month, I talked to Danny Glover, and he actually met Chavez in 2009 for the first time. And this is what he had to say, and it was quite interesting. I want y'all to talk about that in terms of his legacy when we come back. So here's what Danny Glover had to say.
President Hugo Chavez, who embraced the idea around the issues of Afro-descendants. And one of the things that we've been working on, others, my friend James Early from the Smithsonian and others, is creating this relationship between what has happened with Afro-descendants in the hemisphere. There are 150 million African descendants in the southern hemisphere. In the hemisphere, 90% of them live in poverty. Well, Hugo Chavez said, look at my hair. My grandmother was African. You know what I'm saying? How can you want to talk to him and find out how can we find ways in which that direct experience, translates into kind of changes that need to happen in your country, but also in the hemisphere as well.
I'm always amazed when Americans talk about what are American interests in another country when their president dies, and I'm going, it's actually their country. So actually maybe they should be talking about what their future should be about versus what our future is, George.
Of course, we're a policeman. We used to be, not anymore. I think the important thing is how the U.S. looks at him and how the rest of the world looks at him. When people look at him, they say, Chavez, they look at it like, hey, this is a man who used oil money saying we're going to deal with poor people. We're going to deal with poverty. We're going to deal with making
Even poor people in America, when they offered lower gas and to help with heating costs as well.
Yeah, and to help with Katrina. And then so they don't look at him through the prism of America. They look at somebody who's different and somebody who waves his finger at America and saying, you don't bully me.
You know, obviously, I've had many conversations with Congressman Gregory Meeks on this issue, who've spent and got to know Chavez. And, of course, he was one of the reasons why they had an oil situation where he stepped in. And then if you talk to a lot of people, how he help people in poverty and black in that country with education. Even many of them, if you look at the education, even the economic situation, the equality there, obviously he did a good job. And that's the Chavez, and that's a part of his body of work also. But you cannot forget the Chavez who allowed Hezbollah and Hamas to set up offices in Caracas also. Mm-hmm. That is still part of his legacy.
Yeah, it's all a part of the legacy.
It's all a part of his legacy.
That's the point I'm making. It's all a part of the legacy. Just like, look, I believe in freedom of the press. Look, he was not a friend of the press as well. But also, I think, Angela and Michelle, what amazes me, Americans have no understanding of even our own history when it comes to how our country, foreign policy-wise, has treated Latin American countries. This was a president who stood up to the United States, who said, I have something you guys need. Oil. Mm-hmm. And frankly, the reason we were so cautious with Chavez was because of that very thing.
Right. America is a country that traditionally, I mean, we talked about this earlier, even with dealing with the DOJ, too big to jail. It is all about its economic interest. We've seen war as a result of oil. So I think that, again, you have to, yes, look at both sides of his legacy, but I think that for communities of color that are in the most vulnerable situations, he will be sorely missed for the things that he did to create opportunity.
You know, I feel like it's a double-edged sword. I'm looking at both sides of the story, and I think, quite frankly, we're just going to have to wait and see what history will tell us, because there were good things that he did, but this is a man who also decimated the judiciary in Venezuela,
right.
and I think time will tell us what his policies actually did for the poor in his country. I don't think that sometimes we have a way of looking at revisionist history. There were people who thought that Joseph Stalin was a wonderful man, and he wasn't. So, time will tell.
But to me, though, when it comes to Chavez, you have to, Paul Harvey always talks about the rest of the story. Mm-hmm. And as I watched all of these conversations this week, it was all thug, 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 as if the people in the country didn't elect him, as if they were the chosen leader. I'm just saying that it's amazing how Americans can talk about our sovereign right as a nation, but then don't truly respect the sovereign right of another country. Well, if they choose to elect him, that's up to them.
Well, and you've seen it time and time again, not just in Latin America, but in many countries in Africa where the United States went in looking at what we believed our foreign policy interests to be at the time and putting in people who were despots and then turning around and, quite frankly, kicking the United States right in the butt, and we end up destroying countries.
And
we will see what happens.
Real quick.
It's across the board. It's a pattern. The United States always does this. And you have only one perspective of him. And all we're saying in this case, show the other side.
But then also, the United States is just as ruthless and just as corrupt as these countries that they condemn. They cannot sit in no glass house. They really don't even have the moral standing anymore. And Chavez was in their face. He despised America and what she represented. And the elite, the media, is punishing him for it now in death.
The moral of the story is there's always the good, the bad, and the ugly when dealing with human beings. And we just need to see, to Mr. Curry's point, about the good side of this.
The good, bad, and ugly when it comes to Chavez, the good, bad, and ugly when it comes to American present day, also when it comes to our history.
Yes.
Yeah. Don't ignore the facts, folks, because they are what they are.
And the media elite.
Michelle, Angela, Armstrong, George, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.